couple of possible new projects. We gave the go-ahead in terms of the pension plan projects, and we'll see the updated project brief back on that next week. And if you like, we move to the opposite end of the process now in terms of the first sort of serious opportunity to discuss the responses that we've had to the three exposure drafts. Well, sorry, to two of the three exposure drafts that we issued as a group. So the responses to ED70 and ED71. And I think, you know, it's right just to sort of pause and you know, reflect that we got an amazing level of response across these three EDs, 200 responses, and certainly that level of response is actually really, you know, record-breaking for us as a board. And I think that reflects a lot of the outreach that went in, both from staff and members, to explaining the proposals, and then the degree of interest. And very encouraging that the responses were coming in. We had a lot of responses from Latin America, for example, but also from Africa and Asia. And I think that diversity of responses is one of the really encouraging things that we're seeing over the last few years. And I think that does reflect the increased interest in our work, but you know, and the relevance as well of what we're doing. So I thought it was useful as we move into the stage of reviewing the exposure draft responses, just to reflect on where we are in terms of our processes and how we'll move through the next stage for these three important projects. And I think it's, you know, particularly because it suddenly occurred to me when I was thinking about the session that actually the majority of the board have not been through finalisation of a new standard before. The last new standard we finalised was social benefits, IPSASB 42, and that we approved at the meeting in Kuala Lumpur in December 2018. So the last 2 years, we've actually been in exposure draft development and finalisation process, both for these projects, but also, as we know, for the revenue suite of projects and leases last year. So this is moving us into a very different place, if you like. And I thought if we just, if I just ask board members just to have a look at the paper 5.1.1, and that's the roadmap for the project. So just to sort of orient us in terms of the road that we've already travelled on both ED70 and ED71. Approval of the project brief was right back in 2015 at the meeting in Santiago in Chile. And then we moved through the consultation paper process and then into the exposure draft, and we approved the exposure drafts in December 2019. And those are important in the context of, those were the proposals, if you look at our due process, those were the proposals that the board at that stage was content that they would form the basis for the final standard unless, you know, if we receive no comments. Now, clearly we have received comments. So that then set the framework for what we're going to do now. We're going to look at those comments, and that's what staff have been doing, and really look at those in the context of, do they cause us to change the principles that we agreed in finalising those EDs, or do we reconfirm them? Do we need to change some of the drafting to better explain those principles as a result of what our stakeholders have actually said? So we're using those EDs as the basis for our further deliberations going forward. So unless stakeholders say there's a major problem, from a board point of view, what we're not going to be doing is reopening and redeliberating the responses, really, because we've got a different group of people around the table. There's been a lot of debate and discussion, as that roadmap says, to get us to the point of the exposure drafts. And I think that's, so if you like, that's the sort of jump off point. I think in terms of the approach, and there was quite a lot of discussion about how we approach these items. The important point is that we had some problems, I think, with these exposure drafts because we worked bottom up. And that has its merits, but it's actually quite hard to arrive at clear governing principles. And I think because we work bottom up, you'll see comments from our stakeholders, which were actually, had we been clear enough about what we'd actually decided? Had we communicated that sufficiently clearly? So in discussion with Ross and the staff, the tactic that we've agreed to approaching this going forwards is that we should work top down. So we should be clear about the principles, and then we should move into what does that mean in practice. And that's what staff have tried to do in the papers that we've got. And those debates over drafting, you know, I think collectively we love engaging with the detailed drafting. Actually, the idea is that we engage, we really settle on the principles, basically the principles brought forward, which in all bar one case, based on stakeholder feedback, staff are recommending that the principle that the board had in the exposure draft is the one that we should go forward with. In process terms, to keep us focused on those principles, then what you'll see going forwards is that the principles that we agree at this stage will be, then we'll get the drafting back at the next board meeting. So you'll see the relevant drafting from the ED then amended for either the detail of the discussions that we've had or the way in which it's been agreed that we should account for stakeholder feedback. Now we've got, you know, the first set of papers today. We've got 2 sessions today, and we've got further time on Tuesday. So we've got time to deliberate and discuss the principles, but focusing on the principles at this stage. And those principles that we decide today and Tuesday will also form the basis for the discussions that we will have on transfer expenses. So transfer expenses will be the focus for the check-in discussions, really. What does that mean for the transfer expenses project based on what we've agreed on revenue? Because the two do need to work together. Now, I'll pause in a minute for comments and just clarification on what I've said on process. Before we do that, Ross, I'd just like to bring you in because as a result of the number of comments, the question about re-exposure has been raised by a number of members. And Ross, I think it would just be helpful to clarify at this stage what our approach to consideration of the need for that is.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And I'm happy to just clarify and remind everyone how re-exposure process works in IPSASB due process. So in due process, the re-exposure question is explicitly set in due process after the IPSASB approves the final standard. And that's so that the board can contemplate after they approve the principles and the guidance that will go in the final standard, whether or not those have changed significantly from the exposure draft, and merit first a vote on whether they should re-expose, and then whether they will re-expose that newly approved final guidance. And just a reminder on the due process vote, should the board decide to vote on whether or not to re-expose, it requires 2/3 of members to approve re-exposure of the final pronouncement. And the reason due process is structured in that way is because whether or not the board decides to re-expose shouldn't be one of the determining factors on on the principles it's agreeing to change in the standards. It should be more matter of fact, an assessment by staff and the board once we've landed what will make the final standard and approved it, if that's a significant enough change that we should consult with constituents to ensure they're generally comfortable with where we're going. And the reason I think it's important to raise that now is because I have heard in even some staff discussions on this that we might not want to consider a certain approach because that might require re-exposure. And I think I don't think that's all that helpful in determining how we're going to deal with the comments. I don't think that should be a driving factor. I think getting the principles right and getting the drafting right in the standard should drive where we are. We have sufficient time to go through the comments, and we have a lot of comments, and we may end up in a position where we feel we have to re-expose, but that's a decision that should be taken once we're comfortable. We've addressed the comments, they're reflected in the document, and the board's comfortable that it forms the final standards. Then we decide if we want to re-expose. And on re-exposure, I don't think it means we have to go with a normal 4-month re-exposure. We can do a limited re-exposure should we get to that position, and give guidance to constituents on the significant areas that have changed so they can focus their comments on a particular area. So it's not meant to be the same as a normal exposure. It is a re-exposure of something that's been exposed for a specific purpose that we would outline in the communication materials. So I wanted to share that from the staff perspective, because I'd rather we don't get bogged down with whether one principle over another might require us to think we need to re-expose. Let's just focus on getting the principles right in the various standards. And then we'll consider the re-exposure question when we get to finalizing the actual standards. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ross. So at that point, I think just open up for questions, comments, clarifications requested by members. Yeah, Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And from a CAC perspective or a public interest perspective, respectively, I can just support what you and Ross just outlined. I think, first of all, I think you should not limit yourself in making changes or reacting to comments on the basis of, okay, if we do that, we would have to re-expose and we would lose time or whatever. I think it should be kind of driven by what is the right principle, and then at the end do a stock take whether this is kind of a big enough change to kind of justify re-exposure. Definitely, I would argue for re-exposure if there is kind of a change where you are kind of unsure whether everybody would support that immediately, and give the public the opportunity to react on that. I probably wouldn't call it limited exposure because this already kind of gives a little bit of negative notion, but there is certainly a difference between re-exposure and something which is first time exposed. So I agree with what Ross said, but just be careful with the word limited. Thanks.
Let's cross that one when we get to it, if we get to it, I think. I think that's really basically any question about re-exposure and timings and all that kind of thing, not on the table at the moment. That's when we get to the end of the process. Any other questions? It just seemed worthwhile going through, getting the perspective on what we're doing. Yes, Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So again, I like the way you've started the conversation. I think, though, that in some areas of the papers, there are places where the change that's been proposed by the staff may need us to redeliberate. I know you don't want to go over old ground, but I think there's a couple of places where I read it and think, oh, did we actually expose that in the first place? Do we need to rethink it or talk it through? So I don't want us to feel like we can't do that.
Yeah, I understand that, Mike, but I think some of what the problem is actually because we went bottom up first time round, actually we weren't clear on the principle, and that's what we're really trying to do, is focus on the principle. So let's have the discussions when we get there. But, I think in terms of moving forward, we do have to have clarity on what the overall principles are. I think it's very clear from the comments from stakeholders we haven't either been clear or we haven't communicated well enough in a number of places, and that's really, I think, what we need to concentrate on. So, let's take it on a case-by-case basis as we meet each issue. Just one other thing I thought it was useful just to remind us about as well, and then we'll move to Eileen in a minute, is just really, if you look at the front part of the papers, this is section 5.1, this is really supposed to help both us as a board and staff in terms of managing the project and seeing where we are in the process. So if you look at the roadmap on sort of for the overall revenue project, revenue with performance obligations, and I'm on page 2 here, you'll see that all of the boxes are greyed out up until where we are at the moment. So the idea is that the white is what we've still got to go, and conventionally, in considering the final comments or the comments on the ED, we would expect to take 4 meetings over that final stage. So that's reflected in the work programme that we saw yesterday, and we see at the beginning and end of each meeting. If you then move on to the next section of 5.1.2, that's the instructions. So that's what we agree at the end of the meeting, reflecting what's been said. We have both board decisions and board instructions. The instructions are the short-term asks for staff in terms of, we want a paper on this, we need you to focus this, those sorts of things. So therefore, what you see in that instruction section is what's come forward from the previous 2 meetings. So you'll see what's come forward from the previous meeting, and if it's been actioned, it's greyed out. If it's still to be actioned, then it's in white, and you'll see the reference to the board paper where it's been actioned. Once it's greyed out for this meeting, assuming nobody has any concerns about that, that line will disappear for the next meeting. So these instructions are short-term, they're operational and ephemeral. When you move on to 5.1.3, that is decisions that the board has made in terms of this stage of the project. And the idea is that decisions are just that, they're reflected in the basis for conclusions. So as those are actioned and included in the basis for conclusions, you'll see that BC reference box fill up. But during the current stage of the project, all the decisions that have been made will still be recorded there, and they will, then we'll clock up the references. So that's the different bits of that project management, but that's why it's really important that when we get to the end of the meeting on Tuesday, that we're agreeing the decisions and the instructions, and that's the distinction between them. Decisions are things that affect shape of the project. We need to account for those to our stakeholders through basis for conclusions, instructions, operational, and then will be reflected and will disappear going forwards. So just to check everybody's happy with that, and that's the different bits of the paper. Okay, so I think with that, then Eileen, you're going to lead on the first sections of the meeting, so welcome, and into part 2 of the papers.
So I'm just going to share my screen first. And hopefully everybody can see that. So hello, everyone, and thank you for your time today. And thank you, Chair, for the introduction on the revenue agenda item. On the first slide here, we're presenting the timeline that was shown in paper number 1, which goes over some of the components that Ian had touched on in terms of when we started the project and the length of the project so far. As you can see, we've made a lot of key decisions and a lot of progress over the last few years. Now, as the board members may recall, staff presented a high-level summary of responses to the 2 revenue EDs in December. And since then, staff had spent considerable time conducting a detailed review and analysis of the nearly 140 comment letters for the 2 EDs. Now, during this process, we made sure to consider both past board decisions on the different principles, as well as Ian said, considering them together with the constituent feedback. That way, we're able to analyze the individual comments and progress towards the final pronouncements, hopefully to be issued in December. Now, as a general point, the first few papers that we will be going through today will really help us set a narrative and lead us to some of the more complex discussions in the other papers later today. We're looking to receive board agreement on the principles themselves and the permission to take them away, action them, and bring them back at a future session. Now, with this paper, there was no specific decision required, but we're happy to take any questions that members may have before we proceed on to the next item.
Thanks, Eileen. So just check whether there are any points people want to make at that stage. No, I think we're all happy on that. Okay, so move us forward then, Eileen, into the next paper.
So while reviewing the ED responses, it seemed worthwhile for staff to take a step back and consider the types of revenues that are prominent in the public sector, not just for disclosures, as we discussed at the board session in December, but also for the project as a whole. And when we considered feedback over the life of the project, we noted that constituents have consistently reiterated their support, both during the CP stage as well as the ED stage, that there are different types of revenues. So staff looked at a few examples of different public sector entities, and there's a clear takeaway that we've highlighted in the paper. The prevalence of revenue without performance obligations is pretty consistent with the other feedback that we have been receiving, and it supports the board's decision in December to actually reorder the guidance to present principles related to these types of transactions first, as they represent a majority of public sector revenues. It also indicates that the revenue IPSASB should be retitled to better reflect the nature of revenue in the public sector. With that, I'll open up for comments and to hear if any members disagree with the recommendations presented.
Thanks, Eileen. So the reordering we decided in December. The proposal is that we need to think about the titling in terms of communication.
And apologies, Ian, I just realized I was showing the wrong agenda item there. So if you'd like me to put up the slide again for paper 2, yeah. I can do that. Yeah, let me do that, sorry.
Okay, so
I'll just take it down now.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so Thomas, CAG discussions.
Yeah, just kind of remembering ourselves of the discussion we had in the CAG. I think I reported that to you in the December meeting already. I think regarding the structuring of the guidance, the CAG was kind of like evenly split in 2 groups. One group supporting kind of putting the guidance, the revenue guidance together in one standard, and the other one arguing for keeping it separate but reordering it as you are recommending it at the moment. So I guess that would be in line with kind of what a good portion of the CAG members recommended as well. There was only one additional suggestion, and this is in terms of communication. If the guidance would be kept in separate standards, there should be kind of one piece of guidance upfront, which is leading preparers in kind of which standard to be used for which transaction, because that was found to be kind of a little bit at least, let's say, difficult for preparers to identify which standard to be used for which transaction.
Okay, I think that's kind of getting a little bit ahead at the moment of where I'm not denying that, but I'm just saying I think that's just if we can keep the structure. I think the main thing though is that the communication clearly, the titles didn't help our constituents, and therefore we should allow staff to go away and consider the titles going forwards.
Definitely, yes.
Okay, so Kamira and then Lynn.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I do agree with the recommendation of the staff because some of the feedback we obtained from focal members when we present the exposure draft was that the names of performance obligations is not very communicative for the public sector. So they say that it could be even confused with the performance of an entity and not even related to transfer of goods and services. So I do support this recommendation of changing the title once we are we finish our discussions on the exposure drafts. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Kamira. So I've got Lynn, Renee, and Patricia.
So I think I was probably in the camp of one standard, not two, but I can accept if we end up with two standards, and I would support them.
We have the discussion about one versus two later. I just want to focus on making sure members are content with the retitling. That's the next discussion.
Sure. So if they are reordered, they will I think I would definitely support the retitling. I think we should also, and it may not be here, have a discussion about have we got the right split of which revenue goes into which standards.
Okay, we'll need to come back to that, but I'm just taking comments on the titling issue at the moment. So Patricia and then Chris.
Thank you. I agree with the staff. And I think it is difficult to distinguish the type of revenue is related to the use of the term performance, because performance in the public sector may be measured based on different types of indicators, input, process, outcomes, efficiency, which may be considered as the performance obligation. Then the narrowing the meaning of performance in DEGs make difficult to understand of it be by the user. Because this, my suggestion is to these follow titles. Revenue with performance obligation to transfer goods or services, and revenue without performance obligation to transfer goods or services, because the AG 17 is about only one kind of performance required for the public sector. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Tricia. I mean, I think if the board's content with the retitling, then staff will come back at a later stage with proposals once we've got further with the development. So if staff can note those suggestions from you for now, that's good. Okay, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. I support the staff recommendation without any reservation because it confirms that we have acknowledged the magnitude of the proportion of diverse types of revenue in the public sector. So I support that idea very strongly.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Okay, so I think recognizing the reordering that we've already agreed, but also people are content with the proposal that staff bring back proposals on titling to help our constituents in terms of better communicating the types of revenue. And so we leave it with staff whether that comes back in June or September, depending on progress when it seems appropriate. Okay, so Eileen, move us on then to the next item.
Okay, so double checked, I'm sharing paper 3. So this paper was regarding the options to present the revenue guidance, and this is where we'll be able to have the discussion on whether we go with 2 standards or 1 standard. Now, just as a quick recap, back in December, the board made a decision to reorder the guidance, so there definitely will be reordering. The request was to further consider whether the guidance should be separate or combined standards, and that was the question we were aiming to answer in this paper. Now, 2 separate standards is considered option 1 in the analysis, and having a combined single standard is considered option 2. As laid out in the paper, staff are of the view that, on balance, option 1 better reflects the prevalence of public sector revenues and addresses constituent concerns by giving more prominence to and better delineation of revenue without performance obligations by having 2 separate standards. Under this option, we'll also aim to minimize the repetition of guidance where able. So staff are looking for the board decision on which option to proceed with, and we'll then take that away and determine content changes based on the selected option.
Okay, thanks, Eileen. So open up now for comments on the 2 standards as in option 1 versus 1 standard option 2. Yeah, so I've got Lucy and then Scott.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I agree with the staff recommendation of presenting the proposed revenue guidance in 2 separate standards, consistent with option 1 as discussed therein. And it should begin with the guidance on revenue without performance obligations, followed by guidance on revenue with performance obligations. Because this is, as we have noted, the observation of the majority of the constituent is that majority of revenue in the public sector is sourced from non-exchange transactions, and that these are covered by ED 71, and this will also tend to correct the current revenue standards presentation in the IPSASB suite of standards, wherein the discussion of revenue from exchange transactions precedes the discussion of revenue from non-exchange transactions. We have precedence on issuing 2 separate standards. In the case of IPSASB 21, impairment of non-cash generating assets, and IPSASB 26, impairment of cash generating assets. In these standards, there's also a duplication in the presentation of key accounting principles on impairment, but such duplications or repetitions are just necessary to emphasize the applicability of the key accounting principles on impairment when dealing with cash generating assets or non-cash generating assets. Besides, this will address the issue of constituents on complex and lengthy standards if only 1 standard will cover both revenue or will not address the issue of constituents on complex and lengthy standards if only 1 standard will cover both revenue with and without performance obligations. Furthermore, from the perspective of preparers or users, 2 separate revenue standards will allow them to refer or access only the standard applicable to their revenue transactions. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Lucy. So go to Scott and then to Ajith after that.
Thank you, Ian. I support staff recommendation of option 1, and primary reason is I think we need to keep the issuer in mind on this. If you think about option 1, I believe what it'll allow us to do is to put in one place. If you think about revenue recognition, it impacts almost all issuers. And I think we ought to clearly delineate the one that they're going to refer to the most and make that available. And the other areas where they refer to less should be in another one. I'm not sure that's the way you divide it or not, but I think we ought to be sensitive to the people that have to use this, particularly since we have a handbook instead of a codification. It makes it harder sometimes to find the answer. So I hope we keep the practitioners in mind as we organize this as we go forward. But that was why I was supporting option 1. I thought that would be the best way to move forward. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Scott. So then go to Ajith and then Lynn, Todd and Mari.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I was looking at the appendix 2 and option 1. It gives a description of items that are common to both standards and those that are not common to both standards. So looking at these items, I think there are few items that are common to both standards. Definitions and recognition of an asset arising from a resource inflow, existence of a binding arrangement, and a few other things. So I believe going for option 1 with a repetition of these areas that are consistent, that are relating to definition, recognition, and those items that are identified as consistent in appendix 2 would be the best approach, I think, because then the people who want to focus on one particular standard can then do so without actually refer to the other standard. So I would support the recommendation with the condition that these items that are consistent in both standards are repeated in both standards based on what is given in appendix 2 of option 1. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ajith. So go to Lynn and then Todd and then Mari.
Thanks, Ian. So I will go against the flow of the speakers so far. The papers themselves recognise that option 2 would be more understandable and readable. Those are words used in the paper, and would be less lengthy. So that in part drives me to say, well, actually, if they're more understandable and readable, well, isn't that better for our constituents, therefore, to go with option 2? So I guess I remain in favour of option 2. If we remain with 2 standards, I think we need to be really cognizant. We really need to recognise that our constituents in their feedback were struggling with the distinction between present obligations and performance obligations. And the diagram that is in the papers, I think it's on page 6 of the papers, makes it clear that performance obligations are a subset of present obligations. And so if we are going to split the two into 2 standards, have we got the right point of split to help our constituents or not? Because actually, when you then look at the accounting that flows, once you've got obligations, you're then into either a simplified version of the 5-step approach or the 5-step approach in detail when you've got performance obligations. So actually, the distinction in accounting comes from when you've got obligations versus when you haven't. And so I do wonder if we are going to have 2 standards, by splitting off and making the split at the very narrow performance obligations, which is a subset of when you've got obligations, is that really helping drive our constituents to know when they're in which standard or not? And would a more helpful split, if our constituents are confused between present obligations and performance obligations, would a more helpful split into 2 standards be at a different place?
Thanks, Lynn. So I'm going to carry on with the round of comments. So go to Todd next, then Mari, then Patricia.
Thanks, Ian. just to complicate matters a little further, I think I'm somewhere in between the first speakers and Lynn. So when I looked at this, I wondered whether it's a little bit early to actually decide definitely on one or two standards. I can see the reasons for both. I do wonder though whether it is going to end up being a little bit more complex going with two standards, because one thing that I did react to in these papers, if we're going with two separate standalone standards, what I reacted to was this idea of minimizing duplication. I think if we are making a decision to go with two separate standalone standards, we have to put those together in a way that they do literally stand alone. So if you know that you're in a particular standard, all the information that you need to be able to apply that standard is in the standard. So I reacted to the words about minimizing duplication because I don't think that's consistent with two standalone standards. There is some attraction to one standard because you can call it accounting for revenue. We don't have the problem with naming, and you know where to go because you'll have everything there to do with revenue. And when I actually looked into the appendices, I quite liked essentially the flow chart, I suppose, the way that the Appendix 3, the option 2, set things out. So, you know, you've got some sort of inflow or some sort of receivable. It makes sense to ask, you know, whether you've got obligations associated with it. If you haven't got obligations associated with it, recognise revenue. If you have got obligations associated with it, are they present obligations, being the bigger circle? If there isn't, recognise revenue, but if you have got present obligations, you then have to ask the question, are those present obligations actually performance obligations? If not, you're still in that ED 71 sort of accounting. If they're performance obligations, you drop to 70. So I did quite like the flow, and I think the flow would work for putting it into one standard if we wanted to go that way, and it may be simpler.
Okay, go to Mari and then to Patricia.
Thank you. I completely agree with Rin, and so the public sector's revenue, it has a so complex and various characteristics, and so the users have to recognize the relationship between the revenue without resources without obligations and resources with obligations. So a diagram, as Rin told us, diagram shows clearly the relationship between the ED 70 and ED 71. And so in light of the governmental characteristics, so from the point of stewardship and accountability, the users should have to recognize the revenues definitions completely. And so we have to take a holistic approach. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Murray. So carry on, then I will go to Patricia next and then to Chris.
Yeah, thank you. We will agree to present revenue according to option 1, but I think the main argument is related to the clear perception of alignment with IFRS 15, not because of nature and risk associated with the types of revenue transactions, because I think this argument is unclear, but we will discuss during the agenda item 5.2.5. And I'm not sure if the step 3 and 4 may be applicable to the other obligations that not other than performance obligation. Then my suggestion is I think it's okay to split into IPSAS, but I think it's necessary to communicate. It's for me, in this moment that I can see, it's only because of with alignment with IFRS 15.
Thanks, Patricia. Chris, and then I'll sort of sum up where I think we've got to.
Thank you, Chair. Judging from the analysis of the staff, one is tempted to support option 2. That sounds logical, but for me, we need to weigh the cost benefit of duplication, repetition, and clarity and simplicity of the standard. So for me, option 1 is most appropriate in the context of the public sector because of the magnitude of revenue transactions in the service. And so 2 standards would give the operator the wherewithal to make a split, a quick decision on which standard to apply at a particular time. And just like CAG recommendation was, we should rather be more careful with alignment, and be mindful of the peculiarity of the public sector and the revenue profile of the public sector. So I would go for option 1.
Thank you, Chris. Renee?
Thank you, Chair. So I got into this conversation coming into it thinking, being ambivalent about option 1 and option 2, seeing merit in both. Totally agree that under option 1, both standards would need to stand alone, and that would create a lot of duplication. But now, having heard some earlier comments, I also find it difficult to make this decision, that this is one of the first decisions we have to make without having gone through the other fundamental questions. And Lynn brought up the question that maybe once we figure out what we do with the issue of distinguishing between the present and performance obligation, maybe we will come up to a place on that issue that will educate us on whether this all fits in 1 or 2. So I feel I like option 2 because it may be an opportunity. It may be the outcome of a simplified, more understandable approach to performance versus present, the discussion on performance versus present obligations. So I would want to reserve, I'm wondering if we should be reserving the decision about 1 and 2 standard and the cutoff, where to cut off, until we have the conversation on the more substantial questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Renee. So Todd, if you're okay, I just want to reflect on where we are on the first round of comments. So I think, really the range of comments that we've had from members actually reflects the fact that actually there probably isn't a knockdown argument in favor of 1 versus 2. I think, I'm hearing support for both models, and there are arguments backwards and forwards for both models, which is in a sense what the staff have presented in the papers. I think this is where, you know, probably, as Renee has said, the crux of this at the moment is actually that we weren't clear enough on the difference between present obligations and performance obligations. And that is something that we need to work on, because I think that will drive us, particularly in terms of the comments about disclosures, where we know already that we need to take a principle-based approach. And one of the clearer areas where we would need to actually look at the principles of what's underlined, you know, and how that would drive disclosures, is that separation between present and performance obligations. And Patricia put a finger on the steps 3 and 4 in the public sector performance obligation approach, and what does that mean, and does that actually drive you to differences in disclosure? Now, I think you know, this is where you get into that sort of proverbial chicken and egg situation, because you kind of want to see one, you know, versus the other before you can actually make decisions. And then I think we come back to, well, in a sense, we are where we are because we've actually put a lot of time and effort into having 2 standards. Now, clearly the point's been made by a number of members that if you go with 2 standards, then they need to be self-standing. And you need appropriate navigation, as Thomas has pointed out, through the titles and also through text that helps people make sure they're located in the right standard. And indeed, that was one of the things that's come through from our constituent comments. But the reason for having the discussion at the moment is that we are going to need to make progress moving forward, and we can't keep going round and round this. So in terms of a way forward, I think what I propose is that at this stage, we do stick with 2 standards, and that we see what that means in practice and how sharp a division we can actually draw, because that distinction between present and performance obligations is I think, going to be critical in a number of areas. So I think my proposal would be that we move forward on the basis of 2 standards, but that we circle back around this at a later stage when we have much more complete coverage in both those standards, and look at whether this is causing too much in terms of duplication, or whether actually it works better in terms of providing clear signposting into an area, the right area, without actually having to wade through too much additional guidance, and recognizing that there is a lot, that we had a lot, particularly, for example, in ED 70, in terms of implementation examples on what, when you look at from a public sector perspective, is a relatively small area of revenue. So if I can put that out as a proposed way forward, so we go with 2 for now, but that we will come back and review when we have a more complete draft of the 2 standards. And I'll take comments now. So I go to members first, Todd, then Lindy.
Thanks, Ian. I'm happy with your proposed way forward at this point. The reason that I raised my hand, I was just reflecting on Patricia's comment around, wanting to try and retain IFRS 15, essentially, and the reason for the 2 standards. And I can see a 1 standard approach and still essentially retaining IFRS 15 working. And I'm thinking our IPSASB 40 around amalgamations and acquisitions, we very much had 1 standard there that dealt with amalgamations, and then essentially picked up IFRS 3 as the second part of the standard for acquisitions. And if we end up with 1 standard, I think we can work towards trying to retain IFRS 15 within the 1 standard, similar to the approach we took with IPSASB 40. So I just wanted to make that point.
Okay, thanks. If I just take the comments from the board first, and then I'll go to Thomas. So Lindy, and then David, and then Thomas.
Thank you. So I support your proposal for moving forward. Just prior to that, I am in the option 1 camp for many of the reasons as already expressed. The one that also worries me is I don't want to create an impression that this is the mirror of transfer expenses, having one revenue, one expenditure, because it's not actually. So that was just one of the other reasons why I preferred an option 1. I was also wondering, just leading on to your recommendation, if we should then be working on kind of like the generic or the standalone guidance on binding arrangement, performance, and present obligations without putting it anywhere, locating it. Then we can like look at it and see, okay, well, if all of it goes into both standards or the one standard, or if less or more detail is across the two. So I think we can move ahead looking at, you know, the guidance that we need on explaining presence and obligations without actually saying where it is, and kind of look at it together holistically, and then we can move from there to say, okay, where would it be located?
Okay, thanks, Lindy, and that is a sort of, you know, a useful steer, and I see thumbs up for that. But you know, we need to think how it's the same guidance, but set it in context. And okay, so go to David and then to Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I think this is perhaps partly picking up on Lindy's point, and sort of also picking up on a point Todd made earlier. The Appendix 3, the table in Appendix 3, I think is very helpful. I mean, okay, it's there for dealing with a single standard, but it's very helpful. And I think if staff could use some of that table as they take this forward and under the approach that you suggested, which I support, I think that might help to clarify a few things too.
Okay, thanks, David. And I think that clarity is going to be the name of the game all the way through, actually. We covered a lot of ground in these EDs, and we need to be clear about what the approach is. Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And just to kind of add one argument which was brought up in the CAC discussion in December, and I just looked at the detailed notes, which kind of would support the preliminary way forward as suggested. And this is that, and Eileen showed that in the timetable, obviously, that the project has already gone kind of far down the road. And there's already a lot of communication happened to constituents, and some CAC members were kind of quite concerned that if you would now kind of change the guidance or the structure of the guidance dramatically, like putting it together, I think that may cause more confusion with the constituents than kind of keeping it separate and yes, do the reordering that was supported as I said. I think this is also like a little bit problematic regarding Lynn's proposal regarding having a different split than the performance obligation or non-performance obligation. I think probably we would lose constituents if we would go for a different split or logic to split the two standards at the moment. Just to bring that up.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. Lynn.
Thanks, Ian. Sorry, it was just to follow up on David's point, but also in effect what Lindy said, because when you look at the table in Appendix 3, it's a good visual that shows actually there is more alignment in the middle and right column than there is in the middle and left column when you look at what's needed. So I think if we went with Lindy's suggestion about or work up the text of the middle column and then decide where it goes, but I guess it was that table that brought it home to me that our constituents were struggling with this distinction between present and performance. Had we made it clear enough, performance was a subset of present, possibly not. And then when you look at this table, there's so much commonality between the middle and right-hand column that was where I was driving my question about have we got the split right. But I can accept Lindy's proposal about, well, let's work up the middle column and then decide where it best sits.
Okay, so I think we've got a way forward. You know, I think we need a frame of reference to work forward. I think you know, Thomas's comments are probably quite relevant in terms of stakeholder expectations, and you know, there isn't necessarily a right answer on this, you know, for the reasons that we've explored, but at least this gives us a way forward. And then we can start building the two standards, but then seeing where, you know, if you look at either approach, additional guidance is actually required. And, you know, again, I think building from what we've already got is the name of the game, and then we will see what that looks like once we've worked through all the issues and we have the clarity. And particularly, I don't think we might not have been clear enough about present and performance obligations. I think we were not clear enough about present and performance obligations, and you know, what the principles were, and that we need to draw the line. You know, we need to clarify on that, and actually keeping the two standards actually drives us to be clear on that before we circle back. Okay, so I think with that working agreement now on how we work through this, Eileen, if you can move us on then to the next paper.
Yep. So the next paper is regarding clarifying binding arrangements. I'll try to keep the introduction short because this is definitely a paper where we'd really love to hear more about the board's thoughts and comments on binding arrangements. Now, there are a few recommendations within this paper that we'd like to discuss, and we're proposing to first talk about recommendation A and B before then discussing recommendation C. Now, from staff's review of each comment letter, we did note that a majority generally did agree or partially agree with the concept of and definition of a binding arrangement and its role in that scoping consideration. The other comments generally indicated a need for clarification, and these comments have been aggregated into topics, but are not individually significant or pervasive across all responses. Now, as noted in the paper, staff is proposing that we retain the principles that were previously proposed, so specifically retaining the concept of a binding revenue arrangement, which are enforceable, which means accountability, and that they convey rights and obligations as there is little or no realistic alternative to avoid the outflow of resources. This also means that every binding arrangement will include at least one present obligation, and we'll of course be going into present versus performance in the later paper. Now, because the term binding arrangement is used elsewhere in IPSAS, there may be some confusion with these other uses of the same term. So we're also recommending introducing the term binding revenue arrangement. We're also proposing to revise guidance to clarify the specific principles that have been outlined and that are summarized in Appendix 4 of the paper itself. So I'll stop my share screen so that we can discuss recommendation A and B and hear if any board members disagree with the proposals.
So thanks, Eileen. I'd like to split the discussion of A and B, please. So
okay.
If we can take those in order. So if we can have a discussion first about retaining the binding arrangements principle, then discuss whether we need to revise the term at all as staff have proposed. And then at third stage, you've made a number of more detailed proposals, either to change or not to change, to address constituent comments. And I'd like to take comments on those by exception from members in the third segment of the discussion. So if we can focus first on whether we retain the binding arrangement, recognising though that there is a need for clarity that by definition must contain at least one present obligation, that's the core principle. So if I can open for comments on that first point. So I've got Mark first, then Lucy, then Camilla, then Todd, then Mike. So go to Mark first.
First of all, I would like to congratulate staff for this great paper, and it really shows and highlights the challenge we have, as we have many jurisdictions, and the binding arrangements can look very differently depending on the legal system. And this all the more shows that we need to have a principle, but a principle that works. And I think the way it is suggested around the enforceability and the present obligation works well for me. So I'm in support of what is proposed.
Thank you, Mark. So go to Lucy next.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I agree with the staff's recommendation to retain binding revenue arrangements as a core concept for revenue accounting. But however, I would like to raise two concerns for consideration in the revisions and clarifications to address the comments of our constituents on binding arrangements. First is on the enforceability of binding arrangements, which can arise from different mechanisms. I think these mechanisms should be identified and enumerated, especially so if these are other than written or signed binding arrangements. And number two is the application of the domestic laws in various jurisdictions with regard to, say, for instance, the termination clauses of binding arrangements. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Lucy. And we'll certainly have to come back to that enforceability point. And I think that underlies a number of the more detailed recommendations that staff have made. Okay, so go to Camilla, then Todd, then Mike.
Thanks, Chair. I would just like to raise some concerns from Latin American countries with what was their reaction to this new concept of binding arrangement. It was some skepticism. First, because there are situations, well, most of the cases, there are legal dispositions. And in those cases, they say there is not an arrangement because it's actually an imposition. So for instance, the case of transfers between subsectors of when the central government transfer resources to municipalities, they said that is not an arrangement itself, it's something imposed. So then they do not see the relation then between revenues and binding arrangements in this case. Also, another example they provided is in the case of some services are monopolized by the state, and the citizens they just receive these services because they do not have any other option. In that case, that's also not an arrangement. So yeah, those were the main concerns on that. And of course, that applying that concept would imply make modifications to the law in the respective jurisdictions, because it's a concept totally new for them. So thanks.
Okay, thanks, Camilla. That's useful. Todd, then Mike, then Lindy.
Thanks, Ian. The staff recommendation talks about binding arrangements containing at least a present obligation, but I'm just a bit concerned that when you read the conceptual framework, chapter 5, it talks there about present obligations, and to have a present obligation requires you to have a binding arrangement and little or no discretion to avoid an outflow. So we seem to have flipped around from what we've set out in the conceptual framework. And so I think we're going to have to be quite careful here in terms of exactly how we articulate this, because at present it's putting the two ideas in a reverse order to the way it's set out in our conceptual framework. So I think we need to be quite careful and make sure that if we are now departing from what's in the conceptual framework, that ties up, because I don't think it actually does. So in terms of the way the recommendation's drafted, I do have some concerns because of its misalignment with the conceptual framework.
Okay, thanks, Todd. So go to Mike and then to Lindy.
Thank you, Chair. So I had the same point as Todd, and I think it does need to be looked at. I mean, intuitively, I agree with what you're saying, and I'm happy with the word revenue being added into binding revenue arrangement, which wasn't there before. And intuitively, if you've got a binding arrangement, you'd expect there to be a present obligation. Although I then look at the definition of binding arrangement, and the word present obligation isn't there. So I'm wondering then whether we don't need to revisit the definition that we're proposing for a binding arrangement to make that more clear.
Thanks, Mike. So Lindy and then Lynn.
Thank you. And it's just a question of clarification to make sure I understand this. So we're saying that a binding arrangement must have at least one present obligation. So then if we are looking at ED70 arrangements and there is a performance obligation, the performance obligation is on government to perform, earn the revenue. But then when we're looking at ED71, the present obligation is on the recipient to perform to earn the revenue. So then it's just, I can agree that there's a present obligation, but the party that has that present obligation would then differ depending on standard jury, or for now, which standard jury. I just wanted to clarify that's what staff is also thinking.
Okay, I'm going to take Lynn, and then Mike, if you're okay, I'd like to go back to staff at that stage. Lynn?
Yeah, so when I read the paper, I had sort of no problem in principle, but I hadn't necessarily picked up the additional wording of the adding in revenue to binding arrangements. And I just wanted to understand a bit further. I think Eileen said in the presentation, this was because binding arrangements is used elsewhere in IPSAS literature. But I guess my observation would be, if we've defined binding arrangements, we should use it consistently across all of our literature. I don't think adding the word revenue suddenly makes me think, oh, does that mean it's a different definition? I think that would be quite difficult for me. I think I don't mind adding the word revenue if binding arrangements is still consistent, but I think we need binding arrangements to be consistent across the literature.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. So I'd like to get into that comment just in a minute, if I may. I mean, what I'm hearing so far is support for the use of binding arrangements, although I think, you know, in looking at that, there are the challenges that Camira raised from a constituent point of view in Latin America that I do think we need to reflect further on, which is how does it work in the sort of place where you have an imposition versus what's, if you like, a more kind of commercial style arrangement, even if that's a monopoly situation. And I think that probably picks up on Lindy's perspective point, actually. So I think there's, although in support for the principle, that's an instruction that we need to look further at that. I think there's the conceptual point that Todd raised, which is actually, you know, does this really fit with the conceptual framework? And I think that's something that we will need advice from staff in terms of does the ordering, what's the ordering conceptually here? Because, you know, this is the, you know, yes, another example where we're actually testing the framework in practice. And we do have an opportunity, if we think that we've got it right at the standards level, that we can actually reorder the thinking in the framework through the limited scope update. So I think we need advice from staff on whether that is actually needed, because certainly comments came through in a number of places about being very clear that we are consistent with our framework. And I'm not advocating that every opportunity where we have a potential inconsistency, we go back and revisit the framework. But I think, you know, that's something that at the moment we do have the opportunity in this test in practice. So let's use that. So I think that's another instruction to staff to come back on that. Eileen, any other thoughts on what members have said on the first point? And then I'd just like you to just say a little bit more then on the Lynn's point about why not use the same term, and then we'll open up for comments on that.
Yeah, I didn't have too much more to add. I think you've summarized it very well, because it does sound like conceptually we do agree that it's an important concept to retain. What I'm hearing from the comments is that maybe where we've written the guidance and also included AGs, IGs, etc., some of the information we've been trying to provide to clarify what is a binding arrangement might not be as clean cut as we would like. So some of these concerns might just be addressed through how we make those revisions, but staff will take them away and think about it more on a kind of holistic basis, and we'll touch base with members as well to clarify where we can. I did see Lindy's comment that she's withdrawing her question, so I won't go into that one. But in terms of changes for the binding arrangement and also the term regarding binding revenue arrangement, it came up from one of the comments that we received in the letters that the term binding arrangement is also used in IPSAS 35. Now, when we compare the different definitions between the revenue definition of binding arrangement and what's in IPSAS 35, they're not significantly different, but the wording does vary slightly. And I think part of the reason is because the definition of a binding arrangement in revenue was still more so coming out of consistency with IFRS 15. But given the feedback we have from constituents, as well as the board member discussion, it does seem that it warrants a reassessment to make sure that the definition we use here and also the term that we use is going to resonate well and be understood by users when they're applying the standards. So we'll definitely make sure to take it away and work on it further.
Yeah, so I think probably in looking at that, the instruction would be to look at the source material, because both standards actually come from an IFRS. So, you know, IFRS 15, and I think probably IFRS, is it 10 or 11? I'm not sure, on the IPSAS 35 side. And I think what we need to check is that actually, is there a problem with consistency in the ISB's literature first, or is it something that we've introduced for us through our standards process? Because I certainly share Lynn's concern that actually from a constituent point of view, unless there is a conceptual difference, we should be using the same term where it's appropriate. So Ross, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I do, just to head this point off before we go off to do research. So you'll remember we expanded on IFRS 15. IFRS 15 is revenue from contracts with customers. So we made it binding arrangement. So we've introduced this. So I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of looking at that. I think we need to look at how we've introduced it and whether we want to be consistent with IPSAS 35 and whether we're consistent with the framework, but that's not something that exists in IFRS 15.
Okay, that's fine. So, but I think it's still, you know, through our processes, through our discussions, have we introduced a difference, or have we created a problem? And I think that's what we need advice on next time round. I think the principle that has been expressed by Lynn, and I think I saw support from Mike and Todd, and I would support that, is that if we have a term that we're using, unless there is a real reason, we should be consistent across our literature. And if that means there's you know, we need to clarify 35, then so be it. But so if we can have advice back on that for next time round. So I think probably that addresses part B, and then I would suggest we then move into, you've made another number of other recommendations in Appendix 4 to address constituent comments. Are there any of those that members disagree with and want to discuss in terms of the proposals on the way forward? Yes, Todd, go ahead.
Thanks, Ian. I'm looking at paragraph 12 of the paper, which I think broadly summarises the points from Appendix 4, where there has been some staff proposed changes. And the one that I have been reflecting on is 12A2, that past history can be considered in the enforceability assessment. And that does seem to contradict 12A1 to some extent, and I wonder whether we have quite got that right, whether past history is part of considering the enforceability assessment, or whether it's more something that we want to think about when it comes to recognition and measurement. So I do wonder whether we need to rethink that one and think about whether past history comes in more at the recognition and measurement stage, rather than whether you need to consider it as part of the enforceability assessment.
Thanks, Todd. Eileen, any immediate reactions on that one?
I guess my immediate reaction is that I do see the point that past history could also impact your recognition and your measurement considerations. The comments that were brought up regarding past history was specifically on the guidance we put in on enforceability. So I think where constituents were a little uncertain about the proposed guidance was specific to enforcement. So that's where we were trying to focus on what to clarify within the standards themselves. In terms of the mechanisms, as you'll see in the paper, we didn't really propose like a robust list of mechanisms, but we have had an offline discussion with one of the other jurisdictions on how we write the guidance on considering past history, and that it's not going to override the the enforceability considerations and the assessment there. But it is a takeaway on staff's point that we're going to make sure we clear up what exactly we mean by it and how it impacts the overall assessment for revenue.
Okay, thanks, Eileen. So the argument then is in terms of that point on enforceability, and that's the focus for that going forwards. Okay, so I've got Mike next, then Mark, then Scott.
Thanks, Chair. So I've reflected a lot on this past history thing, and I suppose it's the auditor in me, because behaviours are important when I look at financial statements. And I'm now of the view that past history is not relevant. To me, it's the capacity to enforce rather than past history. So the fact that you have the capacity to enforce is important. If you have it, is there an obligation or not, or is there liability or not? What may or may not have happened in the past, I don't think is relevant.
Okay, I see support for that point. Eileen, can you just come back on that then in terms of what that means?
Yeah, so this is something that we try to discuss as well as a staff team, as well as offline with one of the other jurisdictions. And the reason we bring it up is we do recognize that in some jurisdictions, your ability and your capacity to enforce the current arrangement is obviously the most important consideration to have. But we have heard cases in some jurisdictions where you may have a binding arrangement where the terms and conditions within it show a legal ability to enforce. But say if down the line, the other party does not perform in what or do what is expected of them based on the terms and conditions of the arrangement, and they're taken to court, the court may not actually enforce it, even though it's a legal condition or term within the arrangement itself. And part of the reason that the courts may vote in that way is because they'll say you've engaged with this party in the past, there have been non-compliance in the past, but it wasn't enforced, and therefore it doesn't hold here as well. And so we recognize that these are specific cases. It's not going to be the same across all jurisdictions around the world. And I believe that is part of the reason why the AG, which I think is AG 24, was added into the guidance in the first place. So it was included there with wording that we hoped would clarify that it's a consideration, but not like a key consideration that would override everything else. So this is something that we recognize maybe needs a bit more clarity. So staff do have this as a takeaway from one of our earlier discussions this week to revisit that. But my first reaction is we might not be able to remove it because there are some considerations for other jurisdictions.
I think in looking at this, I think we have to be very careful that the issue here is always, is there a present obligation? So if essentially there is a legal clarification at a subsequent point in time that changes that judgment, then that would happen at that point in time. What we can't do is write guidance that anticipates change in the law or in change in the clarification over how that, and I think that has to be the principle, that it's based on the current interpretation, and if there is an ability to enforce, okay, that may change in the future, but it's based on the present, and that probably should be the guidance going forwards. Ross, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I do, because I'm on Mike's point. The board did have a specific debate on this, when we were developing the EDs, and there was a view that this enforceability issue needed to be defined. But I think we were looking at that from a revenue arrangement perspective rather than specifically a binding arrangement. And if we are going to be consistent with our own framework as well as IPSAS 35, I think binding arrangements must be enforceable. So I would agree with responding to the constituents and removing that specificity, because it might make people think that you can have a binding arrangement that's not enforceable. And I think that's probably leading us down the wrong discussion and why constituents were confused. And I do think it's more of the audit perspective, because I kind of, as an ex-auditor, agree with Mike. That's the first thing you consider when you look at arrangement, is whether it's enforceable or not. But if two parties agree to the arrangement, and in that law, in the laws of that jurisdiction, when they sign it, they think it's a enforceable arrangement, then you've got a binding arrangement. I don't think whether or not in the future it was enforced or not should be taken into account.
Okay, so I'm not going to take all the comments before we break. So I'll take 2 more comments and then I think we'll break. So Mark first.
I think in determining whether you have the capacity to enforce an agreement, I think that past practice in the legal environment can indeed be of interest, and in determining whether the agreement is really enforceable. That's why, but it really depends on the legal environment. I mean, we have more principle-based legal environments, more rules-based environments, and I think we really have to leave it to the jurisdiction to decide whether the enforceability is given, and their past practice can be, but it doesn't necessarily have to. And I'm worrying a little bit if we trying to introduce rules, which criteria are and which criteria are not. I think we can give a hint which criteria we think are most likely met, but we should not exclude it, because otherwise we would remove the principle-based character of it. And I think the question of a binding agreement is really a tricky one, because it really depends on the legal system.
Thanks, Mark. I think that reminder is very helpful, that we are writing principles, not rules. And it has, I think the principle has to be that if the agreement can be enforced through the what governs it, then that's what creates the liability. People have asked us, all the way through, right from before we started the project, for clarity. And it seems to me that is the clear principle, that if you can enforce it, then that creates that is the present obligation. And subsequent events may create some different interpretation, but at the point that the financial statements are being prepared, it should be on that basis. So I'll take Adrienne next.
So I'm strongly in the camp of past history is relevant to determining enforceability. And this is because there is so many cases, and I'm thinking Latin America, but more broadly, where something supposedly is enforceable, but past history suggests that it simply isn't enforceable. And so I would I request that we don't take out the reference to past history. I mean, Ian's comment now that the principle has to depend on whether the agreement can be enforced. I think you can only judge that with reference to have such agreements been enforced in the past. So I think referring to the past is very helpful, and we'd lose a lot if it were taken out. So I disagree kind of directly with Mike on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrienne. Look, I think in this, Mark's point is entirely right, that we cannot prescribe rules. If what it says in the agreement makes it enforceable, then that's the evidence that you have to go on. Quite often with these agreements in the past, maybe somebody has said, oh, let's just let it pass, whatever. The point is that's a management decision whether to enforce or not. But the point is this enforceable? If the law gets interpreted subsequently, then fine. But I think what we're trying to do is actually be clear and to set a clear framework, whether people apply it in practice or not. If they choose not to collect income or whatever, that's a different matter. But we need to provide clear principles, and I think that's what we have to do. Now, certainly, we can't be prescriptive because we are not writing rules, and we can certainly reflect in the discussion around this that this sort of past performance point. But the point is, if the law says you can collect, then until somebody says you can't, that's what we have to reflect in our guidance. And when we start drafting grayness in, that's where we get criticised. So we can't second guess the law. Adrienne, I'll allow you to come back on that, but I think the point is we need a clear principle here. And this is the point I made right at the beginning, is the moment we start saying, well, it might be this or it might be that, that's where we lose clarity, and that's what we get criticised for from our stakeholders. So Adrienne, back on that, and then I'm going to move us on.
So I think this is a case where reality might conflict with the principle. So you can have any principle that you like, that it is enforceable, but in fact it may not be enforceable. If there's not enough revenue in the government, you won't be able to enforce it. And if I'm thinking of Eastern Europe and Latin America, where there are lots of supposed arrangements that promise enforceability, but if you look at the reality, the revenue isn't there, and so in the past, a supposedly enforceable arrangement is never enforced. So to ignore that means you put the accountant and the auditor in an impossible position where they're pretending that there is revenue when in fact everyone knows that there isn't revenue. And so I think the reference to past history is the easiest way, is a shorthand way of saying we will always know realistically with the responsibility that you require for an auditor or an accountant, whether there is substance, possible revenue to be distributed that can support the arrangement. But if there's not, then don't ask the accountant or the auditor to pretend that there is. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrienne. I mean, I'm going to go to staff on this, but I think actually what you're more talking about is an impairment issue rather than a recognition issue. Ross.
Yeah, and I'm going to defer to Eileen and Edwin as well to come in after me because I haven't had a chance to talk them through this. But I think what we're talking about here is the challenge between having a clear principle and how it might be applied. So I think we can pick up some of the grayness of this discussion through BCs for one, because there is an important discussion to show around enforceability. Because I mean, if I'm looking at the situation you're describing, Adrienne, and I'm the preparer assessing those arrangements, you might have an agreement, you might look like you have revenue, but I would argue you're probably not satisfying the principle of enforceability if it's never enforced. So I don't think our standard having a principle on that is saying in those situations you would recognize revenue. I think what we're saying is you look at your terms and conditions of your revenue arrangement in your current legal framework and you make that judgment yourself. That's what we mean by the enforceability. I think that's what's supposed to be boiled into the principles in the guidance. So at the moment, we've got to add further clarity on that. And that's slightly different than where the board was when we approved the EDs, where we were very explicit on the enforceability issue, but we were looking at it from the implementation perspective, I believe. And I think that's why we got ourselves in trouble and have been questioned on it. So I think we can pick up some of this grayness without too much trouble and add the clarity that will help people in applying this. But it will be jurisdictional specific and it will be agreement specific. And if you have an overarching term on enforceability, then it might cause people to not look at the arrangement by arrangement appropriately to assess whether each arrangement's enforceable. And that's the nature of these standards, that it's driven by each revenue arrangement you have. So I don't know, Edwin, Eileen, if you guys had anything you wanted to comment.
At this point, what I'm going to suggest is we are due a break. So I think if we can break until 2:45, Ross, if you don't mind just having a quick conflab with Edwin and Eileen, and then just coming back with a staff proposal, if that's okay. So I think actually reflecting on that, just to give you time to do that, we'll come back at 10:02. So we'll have a 15-minute break and just allow staff just to come back with a clear proposal on this.
Yeah, that works, Ian.
Okay, so back everyone at 10:02, please.
1 minute left.
Okay, so welcome back everyone, fortified by some refreshment. Ross, unfortunately staff didn't get as much time as the board for refreshment. Perhaps you'd like to lead off, or is it Eileen, which?
Yeah, I'll lead off. We did have a discussion, and the staff are all on the same page as my comments before the break, that if you look at the agenda papers, 12A.1 is likely the basis for a principle related to enforceability. And that reads, enforceability can arise from various mechanisms so long as the mechanism is able to be used to effectively hold the parties accountable. And that in the supporting guidance, we need to add on some of the points that we've discussed today around how you determine whether you have enforceability or not. But to be careful, because I think the reactions and the comments are reflecting that the AGs as written now are being read on a rules-based manner that kind of override the principle. And I think that's where the trouble's coming from. So I think we need to take it away and have a think about it to bring it back, because I think both sides of the conversation are meant to be reflected by the current principle and the grayness there, but this is really hard. And I think we just need to take away with some sober thought and consideration of what we've heard of these discussions, and make sure we get the balance right between a clear principle on enforceability and then supporting application guidance, implementation guidance, and examples that link into that and help people make the judgment on whether they have an enforceable arrangement or not. At the moment, the AGs are a little bit too black and white, and I think that's overriding people's ability to really step back and make a judgment call based on their own facts and circumstances. And I think that's what comes through the comments. So I think that's where we're landing.
Thanks, Ross. And presumably basis conclusions also plays a part in explaining the thinking about different jurisdiction, legal systems, and so on. So what I'd like to do then is just take, bearing in mind what you said, and I've seen thumbs up from some members, I'd just like to take any further comments on that, because I think, as you say, we need to see on that one, 12A1 does set out principle. We need to see the drafting supporting that. So I'd take Mike and then Hervé Adrien.
Thank you, Chair, and I agree with your summary before the tea break, and I think Ross is right to draw our attention to 12A1, which I think does provide the principle. And what it does for me, Ian, is it gets me across step one in the 5-step model. So enforceability has got to be part of identifying a binding agreement. So we've passed step one. We haven't passed steps 2 to 5 yet. And my question then is, because it's enforceability, doesn't mean that we defer the revenue on day one. And that's a discussion we still got to have.
Yeah, there's plenty still to go. As you say, this is a multi-step model. Let's just put it as a multi-step model. It's not necessarily a 5-step model, depending on where you are. Hervé Adrien.
Thank you, Chair. Not much to say, but my thinking during the discussion was that enforceability is probably, the key issue to I mean, linking and consistently the definitions of binding arrangements and performance obligation. When I raise the definition of performance obligation that says it's a promise, the issue is the promise enforceable or not? And thinking of it, I mentally referred to IPSAS 19 in the way IPSAS 19 defines the liabilities. And you have a set of principles that basically provides guidance to decide if you have to recognize a liability, a provision, or a contingent liability. I would say enforceability is about the same reasoning. It's about probability that the binding arrangement will be or will not be enforceable. So we don't need to go further than that by saying what is proposed by the staff. Okay, there may be many and different mechanisms. Each jurisdiction will apply contingently the principles to its own environment. This is the only thing I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you for that. Renee, final comments, and then I'm going to move us on.
Yes, it's just a point of clarification. So I just want to confirm when I'm looking at agenda 5.2.4, paragraph 12A II, we're not taking this away, right? Past history will still be considered as a factor in assessing enforceability, right? Is that where we've landed?
Ross, back to you on that.
Yeah, I don't think we're taking it away. I think we just have to be careful how we introduce it. So at the moment, it's written very matter of fact, and it overrides the principle itself. So again, I think all we're saying, 12A and all of those points are the staff points in the analysis. So I think 12A1 highlights the principle enforceability quite right. That's the principle. Then there's a number of considerations you need to make when you're interpreting how that principle is applied. And enforceability is an important part of that, and past history can help you. So it's taking it away and looking at it. But the clear principle needs to be positively described, not what not gives you enforceability. That's where you get the problems.
So, yeah, and I think this is clearly where we need to see the drafting. Now, unless I don't want to deliberate the principle anymore at this stage. I think we've had enough discussion. I think we need to see how that has been interpreted in practice in terms of 12A1 as our principle on this. Liz Fee.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just a simple recommendation. Maybe instead of the word can, maybe we can say may, because then it would, I mean, it can be considered when it is applicable. So, thank you.
Okay, so I think instruction to staff then is the principle is in 12A1. We need to see the drafting coming back in terms of the application guidance that goes around that, as well, the discussion in basis for conclusions, so that we can see if that effectively addresses the challenges that we've got in bridging different jurisdiction legal systems. In thinking about that, I think Hervé Adrien's sort of suggestion that we make sure that it's consistent with how we've addressed this sort of problem elsewhere in our literature, that would be good. Just to have a look at that, so that we've got consistency. Okay, so we are just still picking up comments on Appendix 4 in terms of staff proposals in terms of addressing constituent comments. Are there any other areas that members want to pick up at this stage, going down that appendix? Okay, so I'm not seeing any hands raised at this point in time. So I think that's been a good discussion on binding arrangements. So let us then move on to the next item. Eileen, we still with you?
Yep. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, so this paper is regarding the distinguishing of revenue from performance obligations as a separate type of revenue. Now, there were two things we wanted to highlight before opening up for board discussion. As mentioned earlier and in the preceding papers, constituents have generally agreed during the CP and the ED stages that there are different types of revenue. And we've also seen through several examples that the majority of revenue in the public sector would likely be without performance obligations. So this paper and the principles discussed really do relate to a minority of the revenues in the public sector. Now, through staff's review, we noted that the other comments relate more to clarifying how exactly revenue with performance obligations differs from revenue without performance obligations, both conceptually and as applied in practice. Now, from a technical perspective, performance obligations are differentiated as a subset of present obligations, and it's also illustrated in the diagram within the paper itself. Now, they do have a different nature and inherent bias, and for the reasons that we've laid out in the paper, staff are of the view that the difference and the additional guidance is going to be necessary to enable an entity to conduct a more precise accounting. And this precise accounting would better help the entity identify specific units of account arising from performance obligations and capture the actual characteristics of that revenue. This would allow the entity to more objectively and precisely assess, determine, and measure the transfer of control that is occurring. When these units of account are not properly identified, the revenue related to each obligation may not be properly measured, as the entity would not be able to objectively allocate an amount that it expects to be entitled to in exchange for transferring the promised goods or service. Furthermore, an entity may not be able to appropriately recognize revenue at the right time, which will result in the financial statements and the disclosures not correctly reflecting the economic events that actually occurred in that reporting period. So based on that analysis, staff is proposing that we retain the principles mentioned regarding the performance obligations and further clarify through revisions of the existing guidance as well as additional guidance to better distinguish performance obligations, note the implications on accounting, and also elaborate more on the board's thinking within the basis for conclusions. So I'll turn it over to hear about any disagreements or thoughts that the board has on the proposals.
Okay, thanks, Eileen. So open for comments at that point. So Patricia, you're first.
Thank you. We agree that transfer of consideration for goods or services describes a subset of present obligations aligned with IFRS 15. But we disagree because I discussed with other colleagues that this kind of obligation has greater specificity and clearly transfers of control. As for example, a binding arrangement based on incurring eligible expenditure, such as relating to acquisition of various goods which not be transferred to a purchase or a third-party beneficiary, may have the same level of specificity and clarity on the transfer control as a binding arrangement that transfer goods or service for consideration. It is the case, for example, research funding, for example, it's occur. On the other hand, a performance obligation related to a complex multi-services may have an unclear transfer of control. Then I think this characteristic does not distinguish one and another one. And in relation to risk, it is not clear what is the difference based on the risk profile. sorry, I couldn't understand the risk. In our view, some variables impact the risk, such as the object and the design of the binder arrangement, environment where the entity operates, the financial condition, and others. We believe that the risk in a binder arrangement to transfer goods or services may not be different for other arrangements, because I think these two characteristics does not distinguish the subset of obligations. The complexity of the allocation of transaction price may be more due to the design of the binder arrangement than the types of revenue. Then, because these are, I think, it's not distinguished. And specifically about the transfers, because tax and transfers are very relevant in some governments. The types of obligation that is in that are in the EG 17 and 71. Transfer goods or services, perform activities, and incur eligible expenditures present in both EGs do not consider all possible conditionalities or obligations in the design of a binder amendment of a transfer. As, for example, the binder arrangement may be based on output-based, not activities or input. In the specification, in this case, the specification of expenditure or activity is not occur. Then I think we have two problems here. The characteristics don't distinguish the subset, and some kinds of obligation is not considered in the EGs. I suggest the reference about the transfer, because I think it can help the staff and but to understand the kind of design of the binder arrangement. And because this, I think the step 3 and 4 can be applicable for the present obligation that not to transfer goods and services. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. So I'll take comments from Kamira and Mike, and then go back to staff.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to highlight that one of the main comments from Latin American countries on this, they did not find in general distinction as useful, so between performance obligations and non-performance obligations, and they rather were looking for on the reasons why we were departing from exchange and non-exchange transactions. And also they justify that if we go for the performance obligation approach, then we should also then revise the conceptual framework, specifically chapter 5, paragraph 31, for instance, where they are, when they, the conceptual framework refers to revenue, it explains the distinction between exchange and non-exchange. Another concern with this, the performance obligation distinction is that it doesn't cover, or it's not clear how this distinction applies for those transactions and revenues that are at below of market terms. So for instance, the services that the government institutions provide, but that they do not even manage to recover the cost. So for instance, the fee for the university semester, that is only a symbolic value. And they say, okay, how do we apply this approach of performance obligation if we have to recognize a liability, for instance? How do we do that if under the current distinction? So that were their main concerns. And also, if we will go forward with this distinction with performance obligation, they will change the terminology and directly refer in that on about transactions of goods or provision of goods and services, which will make it much more clear for them and on how to apply it. So thanks.
Okay, that's Mike, and then back to staff.
Thanks, staff. Sorry, Chair. I agree with the principle of keep making the distinction as is being proposed. I just worry though when I read the paper that I was getting myself confused around what is meant by the nature of performance obligations entails different inherent biases. What's that saying? I just don't know. So we're making it perhaps more complicated than it needs to be. And in use of the unit of account, how does that actually help us to identify the transfer of goods and services, and are they distinct or not? So maybe I'm just misreading the paper. It's getting more complicated than trying to solve something, I thought. And finally, I was just worried about, we had a long discussion at the previous meeting around eligible expenditure and specified activities, and I'm not sure how that fits in, or does it need to fit into this conversation?
Thanks, Mike. I think the eligible expenditure and activities comes into a future discussion, so that's not here. Again, because we need to have cleared the ground on some of these principles first. Eileen, I think probably back to you, but I'm certainly hearing that the discussion on risk is not helping members. But it's probably again back to that being clear about the distinction that we're really focusing on, and what does that mean in practice in terms of revenue recognition. Back to you.
Thanks, Chair. So I will say that staff has had quite a few discussions about this, because there was really two prongs to this consideration. Is one, we've heard from constituents that they really do think there are different types of revenue, and that's a really clear indicator for us. Now, when we thought about the technical perspective of if we really drill down to the different accounting principles, the accounting guidance, and how it applied to these different types of revenues, we found that it wasn't necessarily like one tangible difference that we could drill down to, because similar to binding arrangements, it really depends on the exact terms and conditions that are associated with the obligations within the arrangement itself. Because of that, we tried to reflect on it on that kind of higher level basis in addition to the details. And when we thought about the nature and the risk, and we had some trouble with the wording for risk as well, but essentially we're saying that depending on the type of obligation, an entity may have more of a bias to recognize revenue earlier by saying that I have already transferred the control or have already fulfilled the obligation, and therefore you're reducing the liability you would have initially recognized at inception and recognize the revenue within your financial statements. In comparison, you may also need to prove out that you've completed a specific obligation under the present obligations to say, I have truly earned the revenue and therefore I can recognize it. So there is a potential bias in terms of how an entity will take the information and take the obligations and reflect that in their accounting decisions, which then result in their financial statement information. And so because of that analysis and the fact that we can't necessarily drill it down to a single difference, it really is down to doing that robust analysis. And the units of account, as Mike framed as well, is more of a way to think about how we break out the different components within a binding arrangement and try to track how that transfer of control is really occurring. Now, we do recognize that even under present obligations, you may have a sufficient specificity to actually say, I can see that you're completing this specific activity in a certain way. And that definitely is ideal because it helps with your overall measurement over time or at a point in time. But what we're really trying to emphasize is that that is almost a for sure thing in a performance obligation, because there's a higher level of specificity that actually allows you to do the measurement, to do the monitoring of that transfer of control in a much clearer way that we see often in the private sector, which has these more exchange type revenue transactions, and how that then feeds here into our performance obligations.
Okay, so I'll take reactions. Lynn.
So I guess just listening even to Eileen there, I think we all recognise we see the diagram, performance obligations are a subset of present obligations. And I think the difficulty, even in the explanation just given, and that's not a criticism of the explanation given, I think it's just an illustration of the difficulty, is that actually all that's really happening from a revenue recognition perspective is that you might have a greater degree of precision that you can use when you've got a particular type of contract. But at a principles level, you're still recognizing revenue when your obligation is discharged. So once you've met that obligation, you get to recognize the revenue. And that in ED 71 terms is when you no longer have a present obligation, i.e. you've discharged your obligation, you recognize the revenue. When you have a performance obligation, when you've met that performance obligation, you recognize the revenue. So I guess that's not saying that I disagree with having this as a subset, but I'm still at a principles level. Our principle is that you are recognizing revenue when you meet and have discharged your obligations. And the fact that in certain types of contracts, those obligations may be very explicit in an exchange type way to provide a good or service, and that might be what you use and are able to use the 5-step approach that we've outlined because you've got that precision in the underlying binding arrangement. But I guess this just brings me back to constituents were having the difficulty in their responses about, yes, we know we sometimes have these types of revenue streams that are really precise and contractual, and we do recognize that. But sometimes it's difficult for us to understand, are we in a present obligation ED 71 or are we in this very precise ED 70? But if the accounting outcome is the same, that when you've met the obligation, you recognize the revenue, shouldn't we be setting that out and then saying where you're able to use a more precise measurement basis, then use it and allocate it in the most precise way that you can across those obligations. And in certain instances, when you are transferring goods and services, there might be a really precise way of doing that. But the principle is still the same. So I don't mind us keeping this definition or this distinction, but I think we need to frame it differently.
Eileen, do you want to come back on that?
I do take Lynn's point, and it's something that we've thought about too, because as you'll see in the paper and through this discussion as well, it's not one thing that we can specify as a difference. And the difference in the accounting for a performance obligation or as a present obligation, it may come out to the same accounting, but again, it really depends on the term. So the entity does have to really do that detailed analysis to determine, am I recognizing this in this way or in a different way, which may or may not result in something different. So I do agree, at the end of the day, it's discharging the obligation that we've identified from that binding arrangement. It's just a matter of how do we actually recognize and measure it. And the information coming out of a performance obligation versus a present obligation may differ because of the potential additional specificity we have in a performance obligation. And that might be where we do need to focus more of the guidance to say, this is the truth of it, but also recognize the kind of higher level aspect of how the principle is applied in practice. So I've said a lot, but essentially I do take your point, and I think it may be a matter of how we do that documentation appropriately as we move forward in the next quarter.
Thanks, Eileen. So I'll take reactions to that from Bernard and from David. Not hearing you at the moment, Bernard.
Bernard just said through the chat to take David first. I think he's having.
Okay, that was exactly what I was going to suggest, actually. So, David, over to you, and then we'll come back to you.
All right, thank you. I mean, I'm listening to Lynn and then Eileen's response. I mean, I agree with Lynn. I mean, you recognise revenue when you've discharged your obligation, and it doesn't really matter whether it's a present or a performance. As you say, it's as Eileen said, the performance obligation is giving you more specificity. So I just wonder whether what the problem has been is that we were too much down in the weeds, and that what we do in revising what the presentation is, we bring it up back more to the principle, which can be expressed as sort of along the same sort of lines as Lynn's expressed, and then in application guidance perhaps go into a bit more detail on, well, in certain types of binding arrangements you will have, or you are likely to have, a set of performance obligations related to whatever, and which will give you a better indication of when you might recognise revenue. I mean, that might be a way forward to try and lift it up a bit.
Thanks, David. Bernard, do you want to have another go?
Does it work now?
Yep. Go ahead.
All right. Apologies. Actually, I just wanted to agree on what Lynn said and also what David just said. I think we had a very interesting graph when we started the project, which was this kind of timeline where we had two extremes of recognizing a transaction. And the one was actually at the very beginning of the agreement and at the last time actually when the payment is due. Right, and I think both are kind of present elements, which can have a present obligation element. But what the performance obligation allows us to do is actually recognize the impact of the transaction over time, and I think that's the whole additional value, I would say, of this subsegment of obligations, that you are able, depending on the performance of the performance obligations, to recognize the impact. And you're not waiting for the point in time where you will pay it due, and you're not kind of recognizing it at the very first possible point in time. I think this is this kind of the spreading of the impact, and that's why we're looking for enforceability. That's why we're looking for specificity in the transaction. I mean, I think this is kind of, to me, in a nutshell, actually, and I think it's laid out nicely in the paper with the nature and the risks. I guess we can do some more phrasing and kind of rethinking the wording here, but I think in nature that's the difference, to me at least.
Thanks, Bernard. Any other points? Okay, so I think, if you like, we're not disagreeing with the principle that there are, which I think was supported by our stakeholders, that there are two different types of arrangements. But I think the challenge that you've expressed, both Eileen, but I think Bernard put it well in his intervention there, is that this actually is part of a spectrum. And so then what we need to do is actually articulate why there is this particular bit of the spectrum that is more specific and therefore is more susceptible to more specific identification, measurement, call it what you will, and then being clear about what that means, which I think is, to Lynn's point, that it is, and probably back up to Bernard's point, that that's a clearer mechanism for deferral, and then the risks around deferral are that you recognise too soon when you haven't actually performed. And probably going back to the start, actually, that actually is how you apply the steps in the 5-step approach. And it may be step 2, it may be step 3, it may be step 4, but actually we need to sort of hang it off that more clearly, perhaps. So I think with that summary of I think the, if you like, the thinking and the concerns from board members, perhaps go back to you, Eileen, in terms of, does that give you sufficient at this stage?
Thanks, Chair. I think this, it really helps because it sounds like we do have support for the principles. So similar to how we are treating all the other papers, now that we have this takeaway, we will work on the drafting itself and bring it back in the future to show how we're going to better distinguish this in the guidance. And I believe it was Lynn who mentioned, Lynn and Lindy both mentioned earlier that, you know, we should try to work on this isolated before we decide which ED it goes into or what parts of it go into each ED. And that might help us to make sure that the way we present it in the standards is clear, but we'll make sure to take that away and bring something back. So thanks for the good discussion.
Okay, thanks for that. And I think, you know, we need to recognise this is probably one of the priority areas for us to sort out, because I think it does loop back into, if this is what distinguishes between the two standards, then we need to be absolutely clear about why there is a distinction, what it is and what it means in practice, which is what would justify having two separate standards. So I think this is a priority issue for us as a board. Okay, everybody happy with where we've landed on that? Okay, then we move on to the next item, and I think this is where we move over to you, Edwin, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Ian. So the next paper is on transactions with components within the scope of both EDs. And as a recap, you may recall that ED 70 and ED 71 proposed guidance for transactions that have components that potentially could fall into the scope of both of the exposure drafts. And the guidance that we proposed was essentially to default to accounting for the transaction under ED 70 unless there's clear evidence that a portion of that transaction can be separately accounted for. And in the guidance, we actually explicitly said, well, this evidence could be a refund mechanism for performance obligations that were not completed. So we heard from a number of constituents, and the key comment we got was essentially what this proposal force constituents to do is, when it's unclear whether there's a performance obligation, we would still require that arrangement to be accounted for under ED 70. So constituents were concerned that, well, if it really is unclear that there's a performance obligation, how can we apply ED 70 since that standard assumes that there are performance obligations in the arrangement? So essentially, there's a logic flaw in what we have proposed, and to rectify this, the staff is proposing to still have the ability to separate out the components if there's clear evidence of how to separate the components within the arrangement. But for all other cases, so including cases where it is unclear if the arrangement has performance obligations, to account for that transaction under ED 71. So since we have written the paper, I did receive comments from one of the members saying, well, isn't it possible for an arrangement with just present obligations to also have a refund term? So to clarify, the intent when we specified that a refund mechanism can be a clear evidence that the components can be separated, we really meant to say that the refund has to apply to the unperformed performance obligations. So it's not just a general refund term for the entire arrangement. We're really saying if the arrangement has portions that are refundable, if the performance obligation is not completed, then that refund portion relates to the performance obligations. So I just wanted to clarify that before I turn over to the board.
Okay, thanks, Edwin. So just for clarity, this is the one instance I referred to where staff are actually saying that we need to change the principle that was in the exposure draft and take comments from members on that proposed change. So I'm sensing people agree with that change. Camira?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with the second recommendation of using the ED71 as default option when there is no clarity. But the first recommendation that suggests a hybrid approach, I'm a bit concerned about how practical, how feasible it is in practice to apply, how complex it can be in terms of materiality, and why not to suggest maybe an approach that only decides for one, so ED70 or ED71, according to which part is most predominant in the binding arrangement. So, and also because this type of, according to the feedback we obtain, this type of situations is very rare. So it's very uncommon to have, according to the feedback, so from different countries, that it's very uncommon to have such a case. So thanks.
Thanks, Camira. I suspect we're going to have further guidance from, or further input from staff on where you have both performance and presence and even different present obligations and so on. So that maybe that's a forward comment. Edwin, back on that.
Yeah, I think the underlying principle will be that if it's unclear, it will default to ED71. So I think in some of the situations that Camira mentioned, like if it really is too complex and you can't figure it out, then I would say that would lean towards ED71.
Okay, so Mike.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I thought I might just mention that when we had this difficulty in Australia, it was a principal issue. So I agree with the principle that Edwin is proposing in his paper. It became more evident in the not-for-profit private sector, where this is quite common, but obviously that doesn't apply in the public sector. But I think the principle is right. We should, if it's clear and we can identify that component that's got a performance obligation, we should record it under 70 and the balance under 71. If it's just not clear at all, 71 should apply.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so that's the decision that we changed the defaults there. I think the instruction, though, is that we're going to need to have further staff advice then in terms of how we address the sort of situation where you have multiple components, if I can call it that, which addresses with Camira's situations in mind. Okay.
Okay.
Good. So move on to the next topic.
Okay, so the next paper is on really the basis of a liability. And we've already discussed in the prior papers that for a revenue arrangement, when you recognize an asset, essentially you defer revenue recognition if a liability exists. So in the exposure draft, a lot of constituents were reading specified activities and eligible expenditures as the items that gave rise to a present obligation. So a lot of constituents noted that, well, in their view, such activities or expenditures won't necessarily result in an unavoidable outflow of resources. So it might not result in a liability. So what we're recommending is that we're clarifying that the recognition of a liability is really based on whether there's a present obligation arising from the binding arrangement. And when we looked at the conceptual framework, that is really driven by whether there's an unavoidable outflow, as I've mentioned before. So you'll notice on the slide that I just made a general statement that it's arising from a binding arrangement, but in the agenda paper, we actually said that such a present obligation arises from a clear repayment obligation within the arrangement. And the reason why I want to step back a bit is we did hear comments, or we did get comments from one member who was concerned that by specifying that the only case when a present obligation can arise is from a repayment obligation sounds too much like we're setting out a rule. So really, we should be focusing on the principle that the liability is just based on the existence of a present obligation, and maybe perhaps say one clear indication of the existence of a present obligation can be a repayment obligation within the arrangement. So we also recommend to explain this in the BCs and clarify that it's not, the liability is not really driven by specified activities or eligible expenditures. It's really driven by the existence of a present obligation in the arrangement.
Thanks, Owen. So open up for comments from members. Yes, Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So this is where I just wanted to chat about this concept of eligible expenditure and specified activities, which I think we're going to come to at a future meeting. I'm really keen to just see where staff have landed on that based on the feedback that we got. But my point was more about this concept of a repayment obligation. If a binding arrangement or a present obligation has an arrangement whereby there is a requirement to repay if the obligation isn't satisfied, I'm of the view that you book the revenue on day one. The obligation only arises when you've breached the arrangement. So the existence of a return obligation isn't, in my mind, sufficient to say that you defer the revenue on day one.
So I'll take comments from Renee and Mark and then go back to staff.
Does staff want to react to Mike's view first, or do you want me
I'd rather just take a round of comments and then we'll go back, if that's okay, Renee.
So for me, I think I'm happy. I'm happy that staff is proposing that a repayment term could be an indication, not necessarily mandatory to have a present obligation. So I think I'm halfway where Mike is. I think Mike has a different view, but I'm at least very happy that, contrary to I think what the paper was originally saying, that a repayment provision is not mandatory to have a present obligation. So that if that's what staff is now saying, that it could be an indication, then I'm very happy about that. Like Mike, however, I don't know if it's staff. Someone just said that the principle is that we need to establish whether there's a present obligation, not whether eligible expenditures or specified activities are creating a liability. But I think that they are, again, factors to consider in assessing if a present obligation exists. So there is definitely a link there. They are used to get to a conclusion of whether there's a present obligation or not. So I definitely think they have their role to play here. And like Mike, I'm also very curious at what point in this project we're going to talk about some of the responses we got from respondents on the particular guidance on that. And I haven't seen it in these papers that we're looking at today. So like Mike, I expect we're going to see that at a later date.
Yeah, that's right. And we will see the guidance on the specified activities and so on. But what I asked staff to do in this paper was to focus on the principle. And I think, and I'll take comments from members who've got hands up, but I think there is a kind of question as to if, in assessing a present obligation, if the requirement to repay is only an indicator, what are the other indicators? So I'll leave that challenge sitting on the table, and I'll just take comments from Mark, Bernard and Lindy, and then I'm going back to staff.
I think what staff has now explained is I support. I think first of all, we should really focus on what is the principle. And I think it was right that if there is present obligation, you need to have at least two elements, which is a an enforceable arrangement, and the other one, it must be enforceable in a way that you cannot avoid an outflow. And I think this should be the overriding principle we should focus on, and be careful not to confuse the subsequent measurement, the pattern, which could have been the problem with this eligible expenditure, that it detracted from the question of what is initial. And I think Renee put it right, that in the context of determining whether there is a present obligation, it may be helpful. Now it's how do we operationalize, or what should we say, what are the factors, and especially the repayment. I would be, again, like in the previous agenda, I'm reluctant to really introduce a rule and to say there needs to be a repayment option explicitly in the binding arrangement, because already, if you look at the legal environment, it may not be the intention to have a repayment because you want to, that the entity you have to fulfilled the public sector objective, but the repayment could be a consequence of non-performing, or maybe performance is the wrong word, but not being compliant with the agreement, and this could be derived from general legal court mechanisms, and therefore I think it's already very difficult to request, and they will anyway have to need to apply a judgment where there is a repayment. But I would also not just limit to repayment, because if you can demonstrate that the agreement is enforceable in such a way that you can also not, you have to comply with the duties of the agreement, which will lead to an outflow because of the activity. I would also leave that to the jurisdiction. I acknowledge that the most evident way is really a repayment clause in a binding arrangement, but I would not. And there is a continuum, of course, and what is at the other side would be time requirement. This is obviously not enough. Maybe even reduction of future funding is by itself, I would also rather say, this is not sufficient. But then when it really comes to enforceability of an action, which has to be due to the agreement, and the entity comes to conclusion it cannot avoid to perform or to follow the agreement, then I think we should leave this room open for judgment, and really focus on the principle, what is a present obligation.
Thanks, Mark. I mean, I think we still have to challenge ourselves on what that outflow would be if it's not a repayment. I'll take other comments, and then I'm going to go back to staff on this. Bernard, and then Lindy, and then at that stage I will get back to staff.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I'm quite happy that we.
I want to try and get a sense of where members are, because clearly we're not in agreement. But then I do want some response from staff. So if you're in, I'll take you, and then I'm not taking any more comments on this round. I'm going back to staff. Lindy, and then Lynn.
So we've got this contract, and there's definitely no performance obligations within the contract. And the contract could specify you have to do something for you to get revenue. We're not talking about that. We're talking about what do we do when there is a right to something, and whether or not that right has a obligation associated with that right. And that, in my view, is only you can have a liability if you must give that money back, or if there's an obligation to return. That's the only way you can recognize a liability in that instance. If it's a contract and you have to perform in order to earn the revenue and you haven't yet performed, then there is nothing. It's executory. But it's only when there is a right, it's either cash or a right to the cash, that you would then need to consider, okay, I'm already in breach if I haven't done anything and I've got the money. And that's why there's a return, that's why there's a present obligation. So I have a different view. I say upfront you're in breach because you've got this receivable, and until you do what you are supposed to, you have to return it back, and you cannot avoid anything other than giving it back or using it the way you're supposed to in terms of the agreement.
Thanks, Cindy. And in a way, then that's the flip side of enforceable, isn't it? Okay, Lynn, and then Bernard, if you're okay, I want to go back to staff for some reactions, and then I'll come back to you. Lynn.
I think my point was similar to Lindy. We are writing a revenue standard, and so we should be reflecting when we get to recognise revenue. And so we have these binding arrangements that put obligations on us to do things. That might be performance obligations, that might be other obligations like certain activities or certain things that we have to do. And our principle is we get to recognise revenue when we've done those things. Somebody might pay us up front before we've done those things. And if we don't do those things, we might have to return the money paid up front. And I think at the moment, the text is written almost with that assumption in mind, that we have some sort of day one receivable asset. Well, we may not, because we might only have an asset once we've done the things that we have to do under the agreement. So I guess I sort of come from it from a sort of completely different perspective, but it ends up with the same result, which is you get to recognize, and we ought to articulate it, you know, when do you get to recognize revenue? Is it when you receive the cash? Well, it might be if you don't have to do anything, but if you do have to do something, you don't get to recognize the revenue until you've done that thing. And if you haven't done it, then the money is due back, and then you've got a liability. And I think we should we should write it from a revenue perspective. At the moment, it's written from a liability perspective.
So just before I go back, I mean, just to remind us that the way in which IPSAS 23 was written and the way in which ED 71 is written is, because of the non-exchange environment, you have to identify your asset first, and that might be cash or it might be a receivable, but you have to identify the asset first, and then you decide what you do with the liability. And it could, as you say, Lynn, at that stage be revenue, or it could be a liability. But the point was always that because it's the non-exchange environment, you have to have an asset first. That's what triggers the question as to, do you have revenue or do you have a liability? And that is different to the IFRS 15 situation, which is where, is perhaps more the thing that you were thinking about. But that's the way the model works, and therefore the logic flow is as set out in the flow chart, and you have to get that asset first before you then decide whether it's a liability or revenue. Eileen, Edwin, just responding then to this point, because I think the question then is it some sort of generalized outflow, which is which could be a repayment, which I think was what Mark was saying, or is it Lindy's position that actually the only thing that actually is there is that repayment, and that's really the flip side of the enforceability?
I think to keep the standards at a principal level, it would be, well, my personal view is that it would be better to say the clearest way for there to be an outflow would be a repayment obligation, but leave the door open. Because I hear what Mark is saying in that if we do limit it to just a specified repayment obligation, that's kind of almost going back to IPSAS 23's condition, which as Mark brought up, like we kind of moved away from that when we were developing the ED. So my personal view would be to just say that a repayment obligation is the clearest way to have the present obligation.
But I think just pushing on that, so what is enforceable that isn't a repayment obligation?
Yeah, staff will have to work on that.
Because I think this is why we had confusion amongst our constituents, that by leaving a grey area, that leaves a problem in terms of how you actually apply it in practice, and therefore how auditors will interpret it in practice. And that's why we got criticised through IPSAS 23. So that's why I'm being quite hard on this in terms of if we have enforceability, what else would we have other than a repayment, i.e. that this is the sort of position that Lindy was articulating. Perhaps I'll take comments from the members who've got their hands raised at that point in time and then come back. So I've got Bernard, Lynn, and then Renee.
Thanks, Ian. I don't have a solution. My gut reaction would be performance of the obligations that are under the agreement as an alternative to repayment. Maybe on your own cost, I don't know. I just wanted to add the fact pattern we have quite commonly, and maybe that kind of helps a bit. Maybe I'm not sure. But it kind of goes to the point also Lynn made on that actually we can't kind of totally ignore how the funding scheme actually works, because you might have prepayments or you might have payments after performance obligations are fulfilled, and that makes a difference in how you look at it. But what we have quite commonly is actually that there are performance obligations which will qualify. There's some sort of a prepayment to that because the transfer recipient might not be able to perform on their own behalf without the funds. And there might be a considerable amount which is not performed or could be be paid back actually, where the transfer recipient, the transfer provider actually kind of decides for mainly budgetary reasons not to bring it back, but to take it into account for future, installments and stuff like that. So I'm not saying we have to mirror budgetary accounting, not by any means, but I think there is a practice in being hesitant in calling money back once it's out of the door, so to speak, without voiding the performance elements which are not fulfilled at the point in time. So that's kind of the fact pattern I come across quite frequently.
So I think I recognize what you say, and this pre-financing and so on is one of the things that we need to address. But the point is that, okay, you might match it against something else in future, or you might fund something else in future, but then that's a financing thing. That's not actually a recognition thing in terms of whether you've got revenue or whether you've got a liability in relation to this, this arrangement, I think. And that's what we need to be clear on. Renee and then Lynn. Oh, sorry, Lynn, then Renee. Sorry, it was that way around. Lynn, go ahead.
So I just wanted to come back on something you said, Ian, which was I was coming at this from an IFRS 15 perspective. I wasn't. I was coming from this from a perspective that we have now determined that you can have inflow of resources without obligations, i.e. no binding arrangements, and then you can have inflow of resources from binding arrangements. And in an earlier discussion, we said once you have a binding arrangement, you must have at least one obligation. And so I come from it from that perspective. I know where we've currently written ED 71 and ED 70 of one from IFRS 15 and one from previous IPSAS. But actually where we've now got to in our thinking is that essentially there are two types of revenue, with one of those types having a further subcategory. You have revenue without obligations and revenue with obligations. When you've got revenue with obligations, you then have a subset which is revenue with performance obligations. And I think the drafting and our thinking and our the way that we articulate revenue recognition should be revenue without obligations, and then you are in this approach that we're talking about, have you got a liability and an asset, and you would start with that as your decision tree. Once you've got obligations and a binding arrangement, to my mind, and the accounting probably ends up the same, but to my mind, once you've got the binding arrangement and obligations within it, you are then into revenue recognition based on discharging the obligations. And then if you've discharged the obligation, you get to recognise the revenue. And I really do think that's how we should be articulating this. And it wasn't coming at it from an IFRS 15 perspective.
Okay, I think we're fighting to agree on this because I think that's actually what we've got. But you're right that the guidance needs to clearly follow the thought process and articulate the thought process. Renee and then Mike.
So thank you, Chair. Back to your question, if there is no repayment, then what is the liability? What would demonstrate that there is a performance obligation or a present obligation? And I go back to the guidance on eligible expenditures and specified activities. To me, that's what you're left with. And I recall the multiple discussions we had on that for the past couple of years, and the specificity of these terms in the agreement, I think, are helping create that enforceability and the clarity of whether there is something to perform against, irrespective of not having a repayment provision. Now, if we're not going there, I'm wondering if the capital transfer is a useful practical example, because I thought the logic that we've gone through over the past couple of years was to develop a principle that is based on the performance obligation model, whereby if there is sufficient specificity in what I'm asked to do as a recipient, I have to deliver on it. And the capital transfer is a good example. I'm given money to build something, so I don't have to return it. I just have to build it. There's no terms to return, and I'm not going to give away the money to a third party other than to the supplier, the entity that will construct my hospital, for example. So I thought that was the way to allow recognition over time of specified activities that are sufficiently specific that they create a present obligation. And so I'm putting it out there. So I'm wondering where we land today versus where we got.
They're all variants on the principle, but the principle is what happens if I don't build my property, what happens if I don't perform the specified activity. At that point, it's what else is there? And actually it's the fact that I've got that funding, I have to return it if I don't meet that present obligation. So that's the point, is what is that supporting that present obligation? It's the return. It's the return. If I don't do it, I have to return it. And my, that's what I'm looking for, is that if I don't have to return the money, then what else is there that stops me recognizing the income? Mike and then Mark.
Thanks, Chair. Interesting discussion. And I suppose I'm with you in the sense that if there's a repayment obligation of some sort, that is maybe an indicator that there is a present obligation. My question still is, you book the revenue when you haven't satisfied the obligation. When you've required to repay the money. So I'm still struggling with when we actually record, except we've got an asset. I'm not sure about the disclosure of the revenue. So I think Lynn's solution was right. Maybe it's a continuum. We just need to we sorted out very clearly where there's no obligation, because that's just income on day one. We've just sorted out there's a binding agreement with obligations. That's easy. It's a bit in the middle that I'm still struggling with.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to the bit in the middle. The point is still, is it a liability? What justifies it being a liability at any point along the continuum? So I'm going to take Mark and then back to Edwin, and then I think we're at the point where we need to draw stumps for today, and we will probably come back on this one on Tuesday. So Mark and then back to Edwin.
Maybe thinking of an example we have in Switzerland. I mean, at the state level, there's often the case that the state level receives funds from the federal level, and they have the duty. And in this case, there is really a law stipulating that the states need to transfer these funds based on, so we're not talking about using them for their own personal costs or something. It's really to transfer these funds based on their processes. They have some leverage to define the processes, but they are generally required by law to spend the money again. And then the question is, the repayment is of course, if they don't comply with the law, they may ultimately have to repay it, but this is only stipulated in general law principles. It's not in this time, because the expectation is that they follow the law and are doing their work. And if they don't follow it, there may be even higher consequences than just repayment. And it could become a big problem for these entities. So the question there is, at the time they receive the funds for the next year to collect, is this really, obviously it is an asset because they control the money, but is it really an increase in net assets, given the fact that they really have to either distribute it to the beneficiaries, or if they don't distribute it, they don't comply with the law, but they have to repay it. So from the principal view, then I think there is no alternative to an outflow of resources at the time they receive the resources. And that's why I think it is still applicable that the outflow can be the repayment, but in many cases the outflow is really given because they have to comply. And I think this goes back to this eligible expenditure issue. So this is a little bit the example we have in Switzerland. Which I worry, if we have a revenue, then the entity would record an increase in net assets, although it is relatively clear it's not an increase, because if you go to the whole transaction from the beginning to the end, it's not intended to increase their net assets.
So Edwin, I'm going back to you at this point.
Yeah, I'll just say first that staff will work with members and take the issue away on what else can constitute an outflow. But I wanted to respond to Mike's earlier point on whether the repayment is really a subsequent event. And we didn't see it as such because the repayment term is already in the contract. And the way we saw it is that until you actually perform or do whatever the contract specifies, the terms of the contract at that point in time says you have to repay the money. So it's not like some subsequent event that somebody has to trigger. The repayment term is always in force. It's just that by performing, you're essentially settling the liability or settling the repayment term. So I just wanted to bring that up. And we actually included an example in the paper to illustrate this, if you want to take a look. So that's in Appendix 7.
Okay, so thanks, Edwin. So I think at that point, we are at the end of the session for today. I think clearly it would be helpful just to carry on the debate a bit further, because you know, I know members are wanting to stray into eligible expenditure, capital expenditure, and so on. And these are all applications of the principle, but I think we do need to go a bit further on this one, just to make sure that we are actually clear on the overarching principle here. Because if we're clear on the overarching principle, then actually the debates that we're going to have in terms of how do we clarify what happens with eligible expenditure, with capital expenditure, and so on, actually become a lot clearer. So I think we just need to go a little bit further on this one on Tuesday. So I think that's the start point, and I think you know, for staff to do a bit more thinking in terms of what you know, how to address the sorts of challenges that members have raised. Okay, so I think that was a good session today. Thank you, everyone. You know, I think it shows there are some really tough issues we're facing here, but the more we can actually be clear at this stage on the principles, the more I think we will get better guidance for our constituents coming through. So we will come back to revenue on Tuesday. Tomorrow morning, morning UK time, we are picking up natural resources, which is also Edwin. So Have a good break, everyone, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Okay.
Goodbye, guys.